With a sudden rush that could not be foreseen, with a strange howling cry that was enough to awaken terror in every breast, the figure seized the long tresses of her hair, and twining them round his bony hands, he held her to the bed. Then she screamed. Heaven granted her then power to scream. He drags her head to the bed's edge. He forces it back by the long hair still entwined in his grasp. With a plunge, he seizes her neck in his fang-like teeth. A gush of blood and a hideous sucking noise follows. The girl has swooned, and the vampire is at his hideous repast.
Andrea, we're on. We're on.
Hello. I'm Andrea Lipinski.
And I'm Keith DeCandido. Welcome to another episode of The Chronic Rift. As we approach Halloween, and as you may have guessed from our little dramatic reading here, we will be discussing vampires on our roundtable discussion.
But first, the second annual Roundtable Awards will air in April, and we're looking for your help in determining the best of 1991. If you've written to us in the past, you'll soon be receiving a ballot in the mail so you can cast your vote. If you have never written us, shame on you. We can send you a ballot if you write in, though. This year, there are several new entries to vote for. There has also been a reworking of some of the others. We'll announce the nominees in late January and early February. Votes must be returned to us no later than January 27th, 1991. So, Keith, what's up in comics?
Well, I'll tell you. There's a new video on comics available. It's going to be aired on public access and will be available on VHS videotape. It is called Word Balloons, Interviews with Comics Folk. It features 6 interviews with some all-around neat folks in the field, and it was conceived, produced, and hosted by me. The interviewees include Joe Duffy, Will Eisner, Gary Groth, Barry Allen Krause and Michael Luck, Terry Nantier, and Denny O'Neil. It was already aired in late September on Manhattan Cable Television and will be aired again on Saturday, the 26th of October, 10:30 to 11:30 p.m. on Manhattan Cable's Channel 17. I'm still working on getting it on Paragon, Brooklyn, Queens, Yonkers, and Staten Island. I'll keep you posted. This week's comic in review is Billi 99, written by Sarah E. Byam, drawn by Tim Sale. This is a science fiction story in which both Byam and Sale not only wear their influences on their sleeves, but wear them on the entire shirt. Byam's story is very reminiscent of Alan Moore and David Lloyd's V for Vendetta. It involves a post-World War III story in which a vigilante helps the oppressed. This vigilante is named Toleado, and her symbol is a T with a circle around it, which is very similar to V's V with a circle around it in V for Vendetta, except that was a nice twist on the anarchy symbol. The T just looks stupid. Sale's art is directly imitative of French artist Jacques Tardy, except it doesn't have any of Tardy's sense of place or sense of much of anything. He even uses the same lettering style as Tardy for no particularly good reason. The only interesting part is the last page, which gives the historical background to this science fiction story, which is a hell of a lot more interesting than the actual story. For one thing, it makes sense, and should have been on the first page. This should actually have been done as a prose story. What the heck. Billi 99 is a 4-issue limited series published by Dark Horse, 48 pages an issue, $3.50 an issue, and is available at finer comic shops everywhere, and probably some of the crappy ones, too. Back to you, Andrea.
Nice about word balloons. It's very subtle.
Hey, look.
It's nothing like tooting your own horn, huh?
Well, no. What's wrong with tooting one's own horn? Who else's horn can one toot if one can't toot one's own horn?
And finally, here's Jim Frenkel with another look at the world of speculative fiction.
Hi, I'm Jim Frenkel, reporting from New York on Science Fiction and Fantasy this month.
Okay, well.
Everybody who knows science fiction knows that sooner or later we start to talk about ourselves rather than the future. And that's no exception this month, where we have 2 books that are really notable for the fact that they are firmly rooted in the present. The first one is Starseed by Spider and Jeannie Robinson. Anybody who's been reading science fiction for more than 15 years will be familiar with Stardance, which was written by this duo. He's a science fiction writer, she's a wonderful dancer and choreographer, and they wrote a beautiful, hippie sort of science fiction saga in space. It worked very, very well when they did it the first time, and this is a sequel where we get more Zen philosophy, great dancing, and terrific shots of space. If you like science fiction the soft way, this is a terrific book for you. It'll be a lot of fun. Then there's Norman Spinrad, who has a knack for being timely with his science fiction. He wrote a book called Bug-Jack Baron, which was all about media and its exploitation and the way government manipulates us. Now he's got a book called Russian Spring. The title says it all. It's about what's happening in the Soviet Union today. Of course, it's set in the future, and it's got a space plot that interferes with the politics and makes it more interesting for everybody, and there's some love interest mixed in. But Russian Spring is really a timely, incisive book about what's going on. Spinrad knows his politics. He's a national hero in France, even though he's American, but, you know, so is Jerry Lewis. I'm not sure what that tells us. There's other stuff that we call hard SF. That means it's got lots of ideas, it's got hardware, it's got scientific ideas. And there's a kid named Alan Steele. He's not a kid, but he's young. He wrote a book called Orbital Decay. And now he's got a book called Lunar Descent from Ace. It's a paperback original, but this is the way they write him, folks. This kid is hot. He's got terrific scientific ideas, and I think you should like his stuff. And then there's Robert Silverberg, whose stuff isn't quite as hard, but he still has a knack of telling a wonderful story. And here he's got a book this month called The Face of the Waters, which is a hardcover from Bantam, and it's a beautifully elegiac, nicely written book. Silverberg deserves to be read. Then there's Larry Niven, who's probably the granddaddy of all the current science fiction writers who write hard stuff. I mean, he knows his science so much that when he argues with his readers, he wins. And he's got a book called Playgrounds of the Mind, which is a lot of short stories, a lot of terrific commentary by him and a couple of other people, and it's from Tor Books. Moving to the fantasy realm, we have this month a book by the person I think is the best fantasy writer writing medieval fantasy today. Her name is Judith Tarr. She's well known for a trilogy called The Hound and the Falcon that won the Crawford Award for the best first fantasy a number of years ago. And there was a book called Alamut, to which The Dagger and the Cross is a sequel. Set in the Crusades, it's hot, people burn with the yearning. Not very explicit, but boy, it's wonderful stuff. And she knows her history. She's got a degree in it, too. Then there's another terrific fantasy this month, which is more in the Tolkien-esque vein, and if you see the Tolkien-esque stuff, it's not by mistake. It's called The Great Hunt by Robert Jordan, and he knows his mythos. He's really steeped in it. He's a terrific storyteller. It's the second book in something called The Wheel of Time, and there's more to come, but The Great Hunt is well worth a look. Then there's another book that deals in its own mythos and continues, yet starts something different. It's called Winds of Fate by Mercedes Lackey. And here we have a person who's created a world called Valdemar, and this is a new series with one of her favorite characters coming back for a reprise. Then there's C.J. Cherry, who's another wonderful writer with a book called Chernivog, which is a sequel to her Russian fantasy, Rusalka. And there's Margaret Weiss, who's known as the co-author of the Dragonlance series, out on her own with something that looks like science fiction, looks like fantasy. You make up your mind. It's called King's Sacrifice, and it's #2 in the Star of the Guardians series. And then there's Michael Moorcock, who's been doing Elric books since before many of you were born. It's called Revenge of the Rose, the new Elric book. Now, the third thing I have to talk about is The Singers of Time by Frederick Paul and Jack Williamson. This book is based on the work of Stephen Hawking, who's taught us all sorts of new things about the universe. And then there's Red Orc's Rage by Philip Jose Farmer, which is set in his World of Tears series, but also deals in the kind of therapy that's actually based by a psychiatrist in Ohio on his World of Tears series in terms of getting kids out of trouble by having them role-playing in someone else's universe. This is a fascinating idea, and we think you'll like it. Well, that wraps it up for this month. Thank you all for listening, and have a good science fiction fantasy month. See you after the World Fantasy Awards.
Vampire legends have existed for centuries, telling tales of the undead creatures who sleep during the day and come out to feed on the living at night. Writers latched onto the idea of vampires as early as 1800 with Johann Ludwig Tieck's story Wake Not the Dead. Other writers followed suit, including Lord Byron, John Polidori, James Malcolm Rymer, and, in 1897, Bram Stoker with Dracula. This novel was immensely popular, and it provided much of the inspiration for the modern conception of vampires. It also inspired the first vampire film, Nosferatu, in 1922, with Max Schreck. Vampires have been interpreted by many different writers and have been given many different faces, and each one gives us different facets of the vampire character. From J. Sheridan Le Fanu to Stephen King, from C.L. Moore to Anne Rice, from Bela Lugosi to Klaus Kinski to George Hamilton to Catherine Deneuve. The definition of a vampire can include horrifying, creeping, enigmatic, vivacious, and even sexy. Here with Keith and me to discuss this very popular form of the undead are, on my left, Greg Cox, an editor at Tor Books and the author of a forthcoming history of vampire fiction called The Transylvanian Library, who has had a little dental work recently. On my right, John Betancourt, an editor at Byron Priest Visual Publications, who is the editor of The Ultimate Dracula. And on the far right, a former guest of ours, Ellen Datlow, the fiction editor at Omni and the editor of the vampire anthology, A Whisper of Blood. Okay, so just as a general question, would anybody like to venture a guess as to why vampires are so charismatic if they are actually bloodthirsty killers?
Sure.
Okay.
Sexuality and immortality. I thought about this a little before. I mean, first of all, everyone wants to extend their lives. Whether they want to be immortal or not is another question. Mm-hmm. But the vampire, part of the vampire legend is that the dead become alive again in some weird form and can live forever, or almost forever. And of course, sexuality. Many vampires are sexy, and I think this is just my take on it. I think a lot of this came about during the Victorian age, and I think there's a reason for that. You know, supposedly the Victorians were very repressed. So that's what I think. I'm sure you'd like to explain that.
I think you're largely right. But the allure of the vampire, I think, goes a little bit beyond that. The film Lost Boys, that you've probably seen, said, never grow old, party all night. What more could you want in life, right?
Well,
why not be a vampire?
Yeah, but you have to be dead young, or else if you're made into a vampire when you're old, then you'll always stay old.
So, but you still never die.
Yeah, but maybe you're really in bad shape. Yeah, really.
There is that.
Permanently in bad shape, right?
I suspect along with all this wish fulfillment aspect, the idea of being able to live forever and having all this, voracious sexual power, there's also an undercurrent of unease about it, too. Otherwise, we would just read utopian novels about superhuman immortals with great sex lives. Right. I think it's like forbidden pleasures, things that you kind of want but feel like not entirely good for you. Right.
Well, that was... Yeah. Well, in Dracula, there was a lot of that. You mentioned the repressed Victorian sexuality, and the women, every time they turned into vampires, they became really sexually explicit creatures. And immediately, oh God, we've got to kill them. It was very Victorian in tone. Yeah. One person who has certainly made vampires sexy and also a lot more popular is Anne Rice. What effect do you think her popularity has had on current vampire fiction, since all of you are sort of...
Oh, I think a lot. I know 2 anthologies of horror fiction where they said, if you get, we will publish the book if you get one of 3 writers. One of them is Anne Rice, one is Stephen King, and I believe the other one was Clive Barker.
But anyone will publish any anthology if you have those 3 people.
Any of them.
Yeah, right.
I think in terms of thematic content, the main thing I've noticed is there's been a gradual transition from novels about tracking vampires down and killing them, the Victorian repressive aspect, to more and more novels these days are about being vampires. Increasingly, the vampires are the protagonists, they're the narrators. And I think part of this is just a cynical attempt to cash in on Anne Rice, and part of it is because Anne Rice hit some sort of nerve. These days, people write to read about being vampires, not...
Right.
And they're also heroic sometimes, rather than ciphers. I mean, Dracula was not... He wasn't really that well-rounded as a character, and I think over the years, the more interesting vampire novels and stories have made the vampire into a more interesting character, just given him a history, and certainly Anne Rice did that.
Well, films, I think, had a large part to play in that, because you keep depicting vampires, where the person playing them has such an overwhelming personality that you begin rooting for him because he's an interesting person and he's the focus of the story, and you can't help but feeling some sympathy for him.
Yeah, quick, who played Jonathan Harker in the Bela Lugosi Dracula?
Right. And also,
and you get into things like Love at First Bite, where you have George Hamilton playing the romantic lead, and he gets the girl.
Right.
This is very appealing in many ways.
I think Stoker may have realized that because Dracula doesn't really play that large a part in Dracula. The real main character of the book is Van Helsing and Harker and the rest of them. They get more what would be if it was a film screen time, as it were, in the original novel. The actual vampires, you don't see them as much.
Right.
So that you can get away with making them bad
off
guys.
stage, so they're more of a menace.
Right.
They're the villains. They're not the focus of the story. Not the central character of the story. They're very much the focus.
Remember, the female vampires, Dracula's brides, in the novel are a bit more extrovert than Dracula is. Okay, they probably have more screen time as well. Okay.
That's true.
What are other characteristics of modern vampire fiction, aside from it being told from the vampire's point of view?
Well, I think Ellen Datlow is probably the most qualified to do that. She's pushing the
idea.
balloon, so to
Right,
speak, of vampirism.
Yeah, I mean, I have been trying with my 2 vampirism anthologies, but I don't call them vampire anthologies. In the first book, Blood Is Not Enough, there were stories about vampires in there, but I started trying to publish stories that were about the idea, broadening the idea of vampires into vampirism, which means that there is something, you don't have to be an actual bloodsucker to necessarily be feeding off someone.
Right.
Someone suggested this might be better called parasitism, but to me that's not the same thing. I mean, to me, vampirism conveys some kind of intelligence. I don't think parasites do have much of intelligence. And with Blood Is Not Enough, Whisper of Blood, I think that's it. I've pushed it as far as I can. I think there may be 2 actual vampires, blood-sucking vampires in the whole book. There are bloodsuckers in there. There are soul suckers. I have dysfunctional families behave as vampires in a way. They suck the soul out of individual family members. And so I've tried to collect stories in this book. Most of them are original to the volume. I tried to show as many different aspects of the idea of vampirism as I could.
Yeah, it's not all smooth talking counts and capes.
No, there's maybe 1 or 2. Well, there's actually a very pitiful form of vampire. That's the one, K.W. Jeter's story, is what happens when a vampire can no longer get his own food, I guess you could say.
That's possibly, I think, the scariest story in the book.
I know, it's terrifying. And I think, it's not only the vampiric aspect. There are other aspects in that story about just an aging parent, a child-parent relationship, which is terrifying. And some of the stories, a lot of the stories now cover that kind of the family. And even the government. That one story by Quinn Yarbo that the government is basically brainwashing this guy. And he's brainwashed, and I treat the government as sucking his soul. So I tried to get a bunch of really interesting stories that pushed the envelope with a balloon or whatever, and we'll see if it bursts it. With a little bit of blood. No, there's a lot of blood in there.
Something you mentioned before about family, I think one thing that has changed about vampires over the years is that, and I think Anne Rice had a little something to do with, is that they've been treated more as a different species rather than just something evil. Rather than just transformed humans, they are becoming, like there's a sense of community among them, that they're on,
Well,
they're sort of...
they're aliens. There are all different ways of looking at them. And that's not before Anne Rice even, but the Richard Matheson, I Am Legend. The legend, the protagonist, if you call him that, the main character, he becomes the evil person because everyone else is a vampire and he's not, and he's trying to kill them. And he's, and that was a science fiction. Supposedly people became vampires science fictionally. I don't remember how.
There was a bacteria or something.
Virus.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's actually set in 1976.
Far off distant future.
Yes.
Things are possible.
I love those things.
The other one that I've noticed recently is parasites taking a symbiotic relationship to the human, and forcing them into vampiric mode, so to speak. Brian Lumley is probably the best known with this, with his Necroscope series. It's been a major bestseller here and in England. Basically, you have alien creatures from another dimension entering our world, entering a human's body and changing them emotionally as well as physically, so that they need to feed on people to survive.
In a way, that's not so far from the Victorian idea. You just, replace the word, demon with, alien.
Right. There was a story that took an alien aspect. It's called Shambleau. I believe it's by C.L. Moore. And with that, it was sort of a symbiotic thing, too, that the person just became so entranced by this thing that was feeding off of it that the host just couldn't bear to be separated from it.
And then there's Nancy Collins' vampire, Sonia Blue, is she's a feminist. There's that take. She's Sunglasses After Dark, and the new one is coming out in 92, and I can't remember the title. In the Blood, I think it's called. Has this female vampire who's wonderful, and she really is the hero. And it's very modern, very hip.
You're seeing all sorts of changes and variations on the vampire legend. You have vampires now who go out in the sunlight and I guess aren't afraid of silver or anything.
Well, Dracula went out in the sunlight. The only difference was, that was something that was sort of added. That was the movie thing. Yeah, it was just his strength was doubled at night.
Right.
But,
there are a lot of variations.
Yeah.
And it's up to every. There's so many different writers out there. As long as it works within, as long as they keep it consistent within their own universe, it works. Then there's the problem of, I guess Paul Wilson. He had a story, Midnight Mass. There's a Jewish guy, and I think he might have been a rabbi. I don't remember.
Yes, he was a rabbi.
And does the cross work, or why does it work? And if it works, what does that mean?
Right, or can you use the Star of David, and why doesn't that work?
Well, and it's an interesting story. It's thought-provoking. There's no answer. Obviously it's fiction.
There's actually a lovely scene in an old Roman Polanski movie, The Fearless Vampire Killers, where the vampire creeps into this woman's bedroom at night, hovers over her, she leaps up, grabs the cross at her bedside, holds it up, and he goes, "Oy vey, have you got the wrong vampire?"
No, in a couple of modern movies, you see that they're sort of moving away from the traditional. We were mentioning Near Dark before that I had a few problems with. One of the things that I wasn't expecting is them going, okay, vampires. So I have my whole list of how they can be hurt. Okay, we have the cross, we have the holy water, we have the sun, we have the decapitation, we have the fire, we have the stake through the heart, and they kept going on about the sun. Nothing else. No religious implements were ever. I don't even know if they ever used the word vampire. He just kept going around going, I feel really sick.
I just need blood.
Yeah, I don't know what's wrong. Can I suck on your arm for a while? It was just.
I like.
Tell them to use whatever will work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think, in a way, the vampire is a very Christian myth, legend, whatever. And because I know there's some. Some talk of Christ being the first vampire, the sacrament. You may not want to talk about this on,
Oh.
There was actually even
Christ the vampire.
there was even a small press book, extremely badly written, but called The Last Days of Christ the Vampire.
It's a terrible book. But think of all the similarities and the sacraments, the taking the blood and eating my flesh and all this
That's
stuff.
just cannibalism.
Well, yeah, that's
Well.
it all overlaps.
It's healthy.
Yes.
Alan Ryan did a story, I think it was called Following the Way, which revealed that all Jesuits are vampires. And they actually, the neat twist was, they actually survived, not by praying on people, it's the transubstantiation thing. They turn the wine into blood and drink the blood.
Oh, that's great.
That would do it.
Yeah.
That would certainly work.
Actually, one of the most interesting vampire stories I've read recently is by Tad Williams, where you have an Islamic vampire.
Really?
Yeah.
Where did that
It was in Greek myth.
Child of an Ancient City.
Child of an Ancient City.
Yeah. There was a graphic novel that was put out called Greenberg the Vampire, which was about a Jewish vampire, and what was interesting about it was that the vampires were not evil at all in the thing. They were all just normal people who just couldn't go out in the daytime. And one of the things he did, he had a brother who was a butcher, so he was constantly kept in like chicken blood and this blood. As long as it was kosher, he was fine. So there's. I'm sorry.
Come on, is there more to this?
No, that's basically it. But just the
He doesn't
the way
say, "Oy vey, have you got the wrong guy?"
No, he doesn't say that.
Daniel Pinkoy wrote he did the Moose Pyre, but he also did one, I can't remember the title, but not Wempire either, vampire. It was something else. It was 10,000 vampires, something like that. And he had one vampire existed, and then he ate, he created all these others. And it went on until it took over the world. And then what happened? Pinkwater is a very funny writer, and he kind of like exponentially, he kind of like did discuss the problem. Well, if everyone becomes a vampire,
who do they feed on?
Yeah.
The Salem's Lot syndrome. Yeah.
Yeah, right. It's like, then what? We're sort of stuck now.
Well, then you need the tourist industry. You need to bring more people in.
Actually, we gotta mention the Moose Pyre, talking about pushing the envelope. This was a book about a vampire moose that sucks earwax.
Okay, we have to wrap it up.
folks.
And I'm so glad that was him and not me.
Well,
my hair.
Anyway, our next topic will be...
What's our next topic?
Will be war in fantasy and science fiction. We will have all sorts of military SF types on. We also would like to have you write in to us. The deadline for the contest has been extended to December 6th. So now you have until December 6th to write in for the contest and join our contest and enter. Please write in and let us know if you watch the show. Enter the contest. Vote in the Roundtable Awards. We'll see you next week.
And have a nice Halloween.
That too.
In part by Comics Interview, the magazine where both the fans and the pros turn to see who's who and how it's done. Read Comics Interview number 100 and see who the 100 most powerful people in the comics industry are. For a free catalog, write to Comics Interview, 234 5th Avenue, Suite 301, New York, New York, 10001. Omega Zone, a store specializing in comic books and video movie rentals, including science fiction, horror, animation, and cult films you won't find at your local video store. Now at a new location, 258 West 15th Street, between 7th and 8th Avenues, in Manhattan. Telephone 212-645-6941. The Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, a monthly magazine featuring the best in short fiction, plus columns by Aldous Burgess, Orson Scott Card, Harlan Ellison, and Kathy Mayo. For subscription information, write to the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, Box 56, Cornwall, Connecticut, 06753. Worlds of Wonder, fantasy and science fiction artworks, featuring painting and sculpture by some of the best artists in the field, including Dean Morrissey, James Warhola, Wendy Ross, David Mattingly, J.K. Potter, and many others. For more information, write to Worlds of Wonder, 3421 M Street Northwest, Suite 327, Washington, D.C., 20007, or call 202-298-7889 and ask for Jane Frank. Draw Books, Incorporated, a leading publisher of science fiction, fantasy, and horror since 1971. For a free catalog, write to Draw Books Incorporated, Department T, 375 Hudson Street, New York, New York, 10014. Omni Magazine is proud to be a sponsor of the Chronic Rift. Pick up the latest Omni at your local newsstand, or call 1-800-289-6664 for subscription information. Tor Books, a publisher of fantasy and science fiction, mystery, and horror books available at your local bookstore, including the new New York Times bestseller, The Dragon Reborn by Robert Jordan. Pity the Poor Vampires. Gifts of Blood by Susan Petrie is the story of the gentle vampires on the Russian steppes, the dying race called the Valkella, the children of the night, who need the gift of blood to survive. Gifts of Blood, only from Baen Books. Available February 1992. All proceeds from Gifts of Blood to benefit the Clarion West Scholarship Fund.